Hey guys, today I wanted to talk about the difference between crit items and on-hit items, and we'll also cover some kind of miscellaneous other AD carry items that are not in either category. And the reason why I wanted to do this is because in the stats video, one of the things that we went over is that in order to maximize your DPS, you're going to want to have a certain ratio between attack damage and attack speed. And it's different for every champion, because every champion gets a different amount of attacks per second out of buying attack speed based on their attack speed ratio. So each champion would essentially have a different line or curve over which or below which you would either buy attack speed or you would buy attack damage in order to be efficient. But as I mentioned, there are a third stat that you can get in League that can increase your DPS as well, and that would be crit, or you can go on hit. And so really what I wanted to get to the bottom of, as a support player who doesn't exactly understand AD carry itemization, is why is one not better than the other? So why would you go on hit and why would you go crit? And what are the differences between the two? Why is one not outright better than the other one? If they're not, what situations is on hit better than crit, and which situations is crit better than on hit? And are there key items that you should really kind of put in any crit build or almost any on hit build that are kind of like key items to the system? And so, like I said in that other video, now you want maybe a mix of AD, attack speed, and crit, or a mix of AD, attack speed, and on hit in order to do the most damage. So let's talk about some of the main differences here. In general, crit is by its very nature inconsistent, right? So when you have 25% crit at one item, or when you have 50% crit at two items, or in a lot of cases, if you're an AD carry who happens to have to build some sort of other item, like an item that doesn't give you crit, like a lot of champions build attack speed in Kraken Slayer, or for the passive, or they build Lifesteal in Bloodthirster right now is very good. And so if you're picking up one of these items first, you're going to be on 25%, 50% crit for an extra item. And so a lot of AD carries are looking at sitting on 25% crit for their first item, 50% crit for their second item. And if they're having to go one of those items first, they're going to still be at 50% crit on 3 items. And so that is a long time to wait for having consistent damage. So you'd have to be at 4 items to have 75% crit and be critting most of the time. So there's a lot of RNG, obviously, in the nature of crit that I think makes it quite an interesting or complex system, because you want a lot of consistency in League. We want to be able to know how much damage we're going to deal. And so to enter into a situation where you have 25% crit or 50% crit, it makes your DPS really random right in the early game, which is also like the most impactful part of the game, since the game snowballs. And this is also why traditional attack reliant AD carries that go crit need 3 or 4 items in order to be really strong, which is a lot of time and a lot of gold in a game that's currently ending very quickly right now. So that's where that scaling nature comes from. So that's a major difference between crit and on hit, is that on hit will consistently on every single auto attack give you that 15 damage or 30 damage or even more right on hit, whereas crit might do more damage when you crit, but it's not going to be as consistent, and that's going to be hard to judge your DPS or your ability to win a close all-in if you're building crit, but you'll be much better later on potentially if you scale. Now, the other thing that's worth noting is that certain abilities can crit, even things like Garen E can crit, for example. So if your champion has a lot of abilities that can crit but can't apply on-hit effects, then maybe going crit is a good idea. If you have a lot of abilities that can apply on-hit effects but can't crit, then obviously maybe going on-hit effects could be a good idea. So there's this consistency to on hit that crit doesn't have, but crit is probably stronger later as a result. in order to make it worth it to not have that inconsistency early. Now, the other thing that's worth noting, let's see, about these items is that there's going to be key items, like I mentioned, for both crit builds and for on-hit builds. So Infinity Edge is kind of the go-to like important item in a crit build because it's going to increase the amount of damage your crits do by 40%. And so this, or give you 40% critical strike damage. So currently the way critical strikes work in League is when you critically strike, it increases the damage that you would have dealt with your auto attack by 75%. Now, when you get Infinity Edge, it adds 40% to that. It's additive, not multiplicative. And so you would go from 75% to 115%. So now your crits deal 115% of your base attack damage instead of the, so if you had 100 AD, you do your 100 plus 115, you do 215 damage instead of 100. So that's quite a big damage output. Basically, you can imagine that, let's say that you needed 100 on hit in order to match the damage you would get if you had 100 AD and were critting 100% of the time. Well, that's not quite right because you would need, because it's not 100% increase on your attack damage. So you'd need, let's say you had 100 AD. If you built crit, right, and you crit, you would do 175. If you had Infinity Edge, you do 115 plus 100, so you do 215. So if you have 100 AD and you're building on hit, you'd need 115 on hit damage in order to do that same amount of damage. But because you would do the on hit damage on every attack, you would need 100% crit in order to guarantee that those would be the same. So you can imagine that there's essentially a break-even point where the more attack damage you have, plus more critical strike chance, the more AD and critical strike chance you have, the more on-hit damage you're going to need on every single auto attack in order to make up for it. Whereas early on-hit can outperform crit because even if you have less on-hit damage, if you're able to do it on every single auto attack and your crits are only applying on 1 in 4 auto attacks or 1 in 2 auto attacks, your DPS might be the same or higher from on-hit items. Another thing about on-hit items is that they tend to give you magic damage on hit instead of physical damage. So that kind of takes advantage of the fact that people have a lot of less magic resist early, which is also when on hit is better versus crit. And it's also going to give your team a little bit more mixed damage as opposed to being flat physical all the time. And so that's another nice little early game thing about on hit. And if we're getting really specific, right, in that example that I gave where on hit would, you need this much on hit in order to be doing the same amount of damage as crit. If you have 100% crit and this much AD, actually you'd need slightly less on hit because if you take the enemy's armor into account, if they have more armor than magic resist, then even if you have a little bit less on hit, you're still going to be able to do the same amount of damage as you would in that scenario. So that kind of lowers the threshold. If it's all magic damage on hit, lowers the threshold for that break-even point. So that being said, what is the centerpiece for on-hit builds? And I think obviously the centerpiece for a lot of on-hit builds is Gunsus. Now, Gunsus, you have to auto-attack 4 times to build up the attack speed bonus. And then while fully stacked, every third attack will apply your on-hit effects twice. So this is initially going to require you to auto-attack 7 times to get 1 double proc of your on-hit effects. But if you're in these extended fights where you're auto-attacking more than 7 times, you're going to be able to apply those on-hit effects again twice. So that's really big because, in the same way that Infinity Edge increases your critical strike damage by 40%, Gunsu's Rage Blade is essentially doing something similar, right? It's giving you extra attack speed. It is... which, to be clear, if you've got on hit, since on hit is like doing extra damage on your auto attacks, on hit is very similar to AD in that regard, right? it's better to have more attack speed and less actual AD in an on-hit build. It's okay to like over-index on attack speed because you're making up the inefficiency in lack of attack damage that you have with extra damage on hit that essentially is functioning like AD for you. So Rageblade initially is going to give you a lot of extra attack speed, and then eventually, if you're in these long extended fights where you're autoing 7 times or 10 times or 13 times, and so you're able to proc these on-hit effects twice, 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, then this becomes a really good item. I mean, you can imagine it probably increasing your damage between the attack speed and the applying your on-hit effects multiple times. It's essentially probably going to do something for you, like give you 40% increased on-hit damage if you're autoing. We could get into the math, but let's say that you had, like, what's a reasonable amount of on-hit here? Unfortunately, the client doesn't really show the numbers. So it's hard to see. But, let's say you had 100 on-hit. If you were doubling that and you do 200 instead, that'd be really good. But that would be better than IE if it was doing it every time. But of course, like I said, you don't do it initially. You have to stack up those 7 auto attacks. And then on that 7th auto attack, that's when it's applying it double for the first time. Now, if you're in an extended team fight and you're able to keep applying this, then it can be, really good. But that's kind of the gist of it, right? So, but it's kind of weird if you think about it, because a lot of early game fights, a lot of little skirmishes and trades that you would have in the early game are probably not going to be even 7 auto fights or 10 auto fights, or certainly not like 13 auto fights. That is a lot of auto attacks. So if you're sitting at like, a 2-item power spike with Rageblade, I don't really know that a champion who's building like that and doing that is necessarily going to get that many attacks off. So I think that that's kind of a high barrier to entry. But of course, that makes sense that it's a high barrier to entry on that, because if it was just doubling your on-hit effects like all the time, then it would be essentially an on-hit equivalent of increasing your critical strike damage by 100%. But iEdge only increases your critical strike damage by 40%. So what I'm trying to get at is that, roughly speaking, without going deep into the math here, I think that Guinsoo's Rageblade is essentially going to increase your on-hit damage when you're able to double those up sometimes by, let's say, like 30 or 40% or something like that. And so it's kind of the infinity edge of on-hit items. Now, another thing that's worth noting about these items is Runaan's Hurricane is kind of a very unique item that's kind of wedged between both camps, which is very weird because they tried to clean this up and make it clear what items were crit, what items were on hit. They switched a lot of items around. And I think that they've done just a really weird job with this, especially with Runaan. So we'll take a look at why. So Runaan's gives critical strike chance. So it's very clearly a crit item. It doesn't give on hit. However, the bolts that come out when you're hitting multiple champions apply your on hit effects and can critically strike. So if you have crit and you're hitting multiple people, you can go Runaan's, and it's going to be a really good item because it's going to potentially crit other champions as well off of those bolts. But Runaan's can also apply on-hit effects from the bolts. And arguably, the on-hit effects on the bolts are going to be better, and here's why. So when you're critting, you're not like doing your auto crit on it. Your bolts do a small amount of extra damage. So let's say your bolt does 40 damage when your main auto attack was doing 100. Your main auto attack crits, and if you've not got Infinity Edge, it's doing 175, and if you've got Infinity Edge, like we talked about, it's doing 200. What was it? 210, 215, something like that. If you have magic damage on hit, let's say again you had like 100 damage on hit, your bolt doing 40 damage is now going to do 140 damage, the bolt. But you can imagine that going from 40 damage to 140 damage is more than 3 times the amount of damage on the bolt. So you would have to have, a crazy amount of increased crit damage in order to do that. In fact, it's not possible, right? So on hit damage is going to increase your bolts by a lot more than on Runaan's. The bolts are going to be increased by a lot more damage in an on-hit build than they are in a crit build. But then, so it should really be an on-hit item because it's better with on-hit, but for some reason, instead of giving you on-hit damage, it gives crit, which, just doesn't really make any sense to me, to be honest. But this is kind of also like a mainstay for on-hit builds then, because in the same way that we talked about, Gunsoo's Rageblade, once you stack it up, is going to like double up your on-hit damage. If you're able to hit 2 people or 3 people, you're applying your on-hit damage to 2 or 3 people with Runaan's, which is really good. In fact, it's cheaper than Rageblade. There's you don't need to hit 7 times in order to activate it once. It just is instantly doing it if you're hitting 2 or 3 people at a time. If 2 or 3 people are in range of the Runaan's. So Runaan's is a very strong item if you're building on hit and you're ever hitting multiple people. Okay, so with that out of the way, we also have to talk about certain item synergies. So some items are going to synergize really well with each other. So for example, in a crit build, there are some items that really stand out as having great synergy with each other. And that would be Collector and Lord Dominic's Regards. So obviously, if you have 2 items that are both giving you armor penetration and lethality plus the execute below 5% HP, which is almost sort of also like armor penetration, Collector and Lord Dominic's Regards are really good together. So a very common crit build right now, especially for champions that actually do quite a lot of damage, is to go like Collector, Infinity Edge, and then Lord Dominic's Regards, or LDR. Very common. Yuntal is weird because it's very similar to Infinity Edge, but just kind of a weaker version in terms of damage output than Infinity Edge is. So it's kind of a weird, weaker version than Infinity Edge that not a lot of people build. Navori Flicker Blade is another kind of key item that makes it really weird as a crit item. Navori Flicker Blade has this passive where when you auto attack, you're going to reduce your non-ultimate ability cooldowns. So let's say you're playing a champion that's heavily ability reliant, like a Kaisa or a Lucian or something like that, and you want to cycle your abilities and get those abilities up really quickly. Potentially, those type of champions are going to want to look at an item like this because caster champions are going to be able to use attack speed, kind of like ability haste through this item. And so they're going to be able to build AD and attack speed. But if they pick up a Navori Flicker Blade, they get rewarded for having a lot of attack speed by getting shorter ability cooldowns. And of course, a champion like Lucian, who can use multiple auto attacks quicker than other champions, regardless of attack speed, he could build AD and lethality and then pick up a Navori Flicker Blade because his passive is giving him 2 auto attacks every time he uses his abilities. So he's able to spam that passive efficiently in order to get his abilities up more frequently. So this is kind of like creates its own category of build. It really doesn't belong as a crit item because the champions that are building Navori Flicker Blade are relying on their abilities, not necessarily relying on their auto attacks as much. And so it really belongs down here with the items that don't give either crit or on hit. So, that's a strange one as well. Then if we look at on-hit items, now some of these, when we're talking mostly about AD carry, some of these on-hit items aren't really meant for AD carry or don't really do well on AD carry, like Black Cleaver gives, a lot of health, and so it's not necessarily a good item on AD carry. There's a lot better armor penetration items for AD carries, and the way Black Cleaver works, because abilities, it's just dealing any physical damage to a champion applies a stack of armor reduction. A lot of times it's champions that can apply AoE, physical damage, or have lots of abilities that they can use to quickly get this off, get a lot of stacks off of this, are the type of champions that are good with this. And a lot of times, again, that's not really what you're looking for as an on-hit AD carry. So technically this has an on-hit effect, but its on-hit effect is armor penetration, which is not quite what we're looking for to maximize our DPS here. Plus the health, and then of course Ravenous Hydra and Titanic Hydra are not really options for AD carries. And an Iceborne Gauntlet, same thing as tank item, and its on-hit effect, is like the Sheen proc and the slow, so that's a little bit different. And then Lichbane is an AP item. So many of these items, right, we could just kind of get rid of, aren't really AD carry centric items. Black Cleaver, actually, of them, is probably the one that you could most consider. People did used to build back in the day Black Cleaver on Ashe a little bit, but those were different circumstances when the item was in a different state. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily viable, but it's certainly the one that's most able to be built on AD carry. But again, very weird. Why is Runaan sitting in both crit and on hit? In fact, even when you look up here, crit and on hit, it shows it in both categories. So that's, it's a very strange item that they haven't made it clear which category it goes in after they've been trying to clean up these categories. And then certain champions are going to be able to go man immune and tier. But, a lot of champions just aren't going to be able to build this item. Obviously, a champion like Kaisa that benefits from having some AP, maybe even a Varus, or maybe even a Kog'Maw could look at going like an Asher's Tooth. But obviously, a lot of AD carry champions aren't going to be able to build these two, so they're kind of like niche, unique items. So let's see here. What are some items that we didn't mention? So same thing with like Sheen items like Essence Reaver and Triforce both have... Essence Reaver doesn't have Sheen in it anymore. My bad. Well, let's talk about Triforce. So Sheen users are obviously going to want to use an ability first, and then they're going to auto attack using the Sheen proc. And so they need to have an ability that they can use on the Sheen's cooldown. So they need to have an ability that they can use about every 2 seconds. So a Caitlyn is not going to go Triforce ever because she's not a Sheen user. She doesn't have the ability to, to get a Sheen proc off every 2 seconds. Champion like Ezreal, who can spam his Q every 2 seconds, is going to love this because he can Q auto over and over again to get Sheen procs. Even a champion... Well, it used to be the case, like old Corki, with many, many rockets. But even the new Corki, right? You have a bunch of rockets. They're pretty low mana cost, decently low cooldown. You have a bunch of them in reserve. You can potentially go Triforce, right? And then use, your ultimate rockets mostly as Sheen procs. And you can also, all three of his other abilities are also fine, longer cooldown, but also able to proc Sheen. So he's going to be able to pretty consistently use Sheen if he's playing correctly in a fight. So there are certain champions that can use Triforce, certain champions that can use Man Immune, certain champions that can use Nashers, but they're very, very niche, right? They're very set to a specific pool of champions. A champion that wants to get a lot of mana for some reason, and is able to stack tier, a champion that wants some magic damage, a lot of ability power for some reason, and a champion that wants, that is able to proc Sheen and use that efficiently. Now, an item like Essence Reaver doesn't grant like extra... this is strange too. Essence Reaver is also on hit and crit, like Runaan's. So Essence Reaver also has a kind of an unclear identity, but it's really more of a crit item than it is an on-hit item. The on-hit effect, right, is that you gain mana back. And so this is an item that, again, you would want to build more on casters, champions that are going to want a lot of mana, champions like Ezreal, maybe Lucian, things like that. Champions that are going to want to be able to spam their abilities and get mana back for their auto attacks. So, this is kind of in a weird category. It doesn't give any on-hit extra damage, though, so it's, again, kind of an item that's not really going to maximize your DPS in an on-hit build. So that really leaves us, like, if we're trying to just kind of maximize DPS, if we're not a champion that synergizes really well with one of these kind of specialty items, our generic on-hit items are like Wit's End, Runaan's, Rageblade, Terminus even is decent. Um, Static Shiv, right, is fine. Um, Kraken Slayer and Blade of the Ruin King, these are kind of, they have their niche, but they're very generic and can be built on almost any on hit type champion. Same thing like when we come up to crit, we have items like this. Like this is a fine defensive crit item, but obviously this could be built on a lot of champions. Phantom Dancer is a very basic standard crit item that's going to work on like any champion that's auto attacking a lot, and all crit champions are. Rapid fire cannon is going to be good on certain 80 carries that can somehow make use of the extended auto. So maybe you're playing a champion that has the ability to so certain synergies, right? Like Caitlyn, right, does a lot of damage on a particular auto. Jhin does a lot of damage on a particular auto. So if Jhin can use rapid fire cannon to get a force shot or to set himself up for a W by being able to auto from a longer range, these are the type of champions that have synergy with rapid fire. Another interesting little note about rapid fire is that if Quirky has rapid fire up and he uses E, until he auto attacks with the rapid fire auto, it will extend the length of his E Gatling gun all the way out to the edge of the rapid fire range. So very interesting on that one, right? So that's sort of a little bit of a synergy because it makes your E bigger, but certainly not the same amazing synergy. Like that's just kind of interesting that it works that way. It's not really an amazing synergy like it would be with Caitlyn or Jhin. And then of course, if you auto attack it, it just gets smaller. So, very interesting there. But so the generic ones here are you're going to have like Collector, LDR, Phantom Dancer, Infinity Edge, Immortal Shield Bow as kind of like a defensive option. Runaan Hurricane is fine if you're able to hit multiple people. These are kind of very traditional, easy to see how they would be used. Again, Yuntal is just kind of outperformed. Essence Reaver is going to be for certain champions that are able to auto attack a lot and want mana back, like casters. Like we talked about, rapid fire, certain niche 80 carries that are going to be able to get a huge benefit from the extra range. And Navori Flicker Blade on champions that are kind of casters, want to be able to get their abilities up really quickly. And then Storm Razor. Storm Razor is kind of a decent generic option as well, actually, for a crit item. And then Mortal Reminder, but Mortal Reminder is exclusive, right, to LDR. So usually you wouldn't build it, but maybe if you need anti-heal for some reason, usually, again, it's better for mages to get anti-heal, or even for tanks to get anti-heal with Bramble. I think that obviously, unless you're a champion that can hit multiple targets very easily, frequently, it's not a good idea to get 80 carries are for the most part single target champions, because they're hitting people mostly with their basic attacks. Anti-heal is better on champions that can apply anti-heal to the entire enemy team because they're hitting 3 or 4 people a fight or 5 people a fight with their abilities. So it's actually much better on champions that have big AoE abilities or abilities that come up super frequently that they can spam. So of the anti-heal items, Executioner's Calling is one of the worst. But obviously there are some situations where you'll get it. And then, like I said, we've got also lethality options. So for a lot of champions that are casters, again, they kind of have an option here. And maybe this is an interesting option to explore. But the difference between going, Navori Flicker Blades and Essence Reaver and Infinity Edge and being able to get a really strong both 3-item crit build, but also a build that's giving you a lot of, well, maybe that build lacks attack speed, actually. That build has 0 attack speed, so maybe that's not the best. Actually, Navori Flicker Blade has 40% attack speed. Yeah, maybe it's not the worst. But anyways, do you go lethality on caster champions, or since they've provided so many options here, you can even, of course, go Collector, which builds lethality, gives you lethality and crit. There's a lot of options here between Navori Flicker Blades, Essence Reaver, Infinity Edge, Collector, and LDR to be able to essentially go like a really strong caster build that still gives you 75%, 100% crit. Why do that versus build lethality items, for example? That's kind of an interesting question. I don't really know the answer to that. And then, of course, we've got some niche one-off items, so like lethality, etc. This is more of a bruiser item, but so if you're playing an 80 carry champion, you're probably going to opt, if you're going to buy anti-heal, to either sit on executioners or to buy mortal reminder. Eclipse is no longer a lethality item, so it just gives you 70 attack damage, 15 ability haste, and the shield when you use its passive. So this is kind of an interesting, potentially, I mean, it's mostly an assassin item, right? But it's also or a bruiser item, but it's something that you could look at building on certain 80 carries as well. Even still, this is a lethality item, right? Experimental hexplate. Your ultimate spells gain ability haste. So if you're a really ultimate focus champion who also wants attack damage and on hit and to become a little bit tanky, experimental hexplate can work on certain champions. It can work on Ashe, it can work on Varus, but maybe there's better builds out there right now for those champions, and so they don't go it. So this is kind of a weird one-off item, right? This is lethality again, lethality. And then of course we have like defensive AD, kind of a AD caster item because it doesn't give any attack speed, but it's fine. I mean, if you're building other attack speed items, you're probably fine. And this is going to give you a lot of defense against a lot of magic damage. Even just picking up a Hex Drinker can be good for that. Spear of Shojin, your non-ultimate spells gain ability haste. So this is very similar to actually, right, to Navori Flicker Blades. So, when would you go each of those? Spells grant stacks. Your spells deal increased damage for each stack. So it's going to make your abilities do even more damage there with that. But it comes with 300 health, and it's a little bit expensive. So maybe that's why a lot of these 80 carries prefer, a lot cheaper item in Flicker Blades. And also you would have to look at the amount of non-ultimate ability haste that you actually get. The other thing is this is a static amount, whereas Navori Flicker Blades is going to give you potentially more ability haste if you're attacking really fast, right? There'd be a break-even point there depending on how fast you're auto-attacking. And so that could be good, like we talked about with champions like Lucian. They're able to get like the double auto and stuff like that. That could be very interesting. Zephyr, just as an upgrade to Berserker Greaves when you're finishing your boots as a 6th item. Sundered Sky, again, more of a bruiser item than an 80 carry item, but I put a lot of 80 items over here that didn't fall in those categories. GA, obviously, as a unique defensive item. Death Stance, I don't really think there's a lot of 80 carries that are going to build Death Stance, but they did in the past, but that was when Death Stance was a lot better. Cerildus is also just a lethality item now, and then of course you've got QSS or Merc Skim, which is really good against CC. It gives you a little bit of magic resist. And then Bloodthirster is really worth talking about because it's really strong right now since they changed it a little bit back to being able to convert that health that you receive into increased maximum health as a shield. So there's a lot of champions like Misfortune that are opting to just build this item outright first. It's a great part of any decent 80 carry build right now, and it's performing very well across the board on hit champions, on crit champions. It's just a really good defensive item. It gives you a lot of lifesteal, so very, very interesting there, right? There's not a lot of lifesteal options. Obviously, like, Immortal Shieldbow doesn't even give you lifesteal anymore. So see, there's just really no lifesteal options other than Bloodthirster. And like we talked about, another synergy that you can have when you're attacking very frequently and doing a lot of DPS as an 80 carry is having lifesteal, so that you can give yourself more durability, especially if you're a shorter range champion, especially if you're immobile and very vulnerable. Being able to build Bloodthirster is a really powerful way to protect yourself. And, so it's performing very well right now. So I hope that gives you a better idea of the difference between crit items and on-hit items. And obviously you would, want to look into the stats for each individual champion that you're trying to build, see if there's a crit build for the champion, see if there's an on-hit build, maybe take a look at which one's doing better and what one more people are going. And, so obviously you're going to base things off of that. But, keep in mind, right, that there are generally crit builds are going to be better later. You're going to need to get to 3 or 4 items plus boots to be really powerful, plus an extra item if you're going to go Bloodthirster in there. On-hit builds, much better early. So on-hit builds are going to be much better on champions that spike early. Oh, another thing I have to mention, right? Really, really important, actually. So obviously, certain champions that have crit built into their kit in some way. So like Caitlyn getting to crit guaranteed on her headshot, or Jhin getting to crit guaranteed on his 4th auto attack, right? They're going to love Infinity Edge because they have built into their kit much more frequent crits than normal champions. Whereas some champions have on-hit built into their abilities. So for example, Vayne W has on-hit, Varus W has on-hit, etc. A lot of Kog'Maw W, I think, has some on-hit. So a lot of AD carries have on-hit built into their build. Well, now if you have on-hit and you go Runaan, and you're able to apply that to multiple people. Kai'Sa also has on-hit, by the way. So her passive plasma stacks, she does extra magic damage for each stack that she's applied to the person. So every time, even if she doesn't pop her passive, she's doing extra magic damage and more for each passive stack she has on somebody. So champion like Kai'Sa, this is one of the reasons why she goes on-hit. Really going to benefit from Rageblade being able to apply those effects twice. Really going to benefit from Runaan's being able to apply those effects 2 or 3 times. So twice or 3 times instantly, as long as you're able to, fight against a team where you're able to hit 2 or 3 people with Runaan's at the same time. Could even be better than Rageblade because there's no having to build it up, and it's 400 gold cheaper. So Runaan's very nice in that regard. So there's very interesting options here. So I hope that gives you a better idea of like on-hit being better on champions that have on-hit built into their kit because they're able to apply it multiple times. Crit being better on champions that have crit built into their kit like Caitlyn and Jhin because they're going to increase their inherent damage in their kit by using that. And of course Caitlyn gets her headshot many different ways, from her passive, from her hitting her E, from hitting traps and things like that. So lots of ways to get that there on a champion like that. So hope that helps. Good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.